Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at White Star, the white box science fiction role-playing game. This is written by James M. Spahn. Apologies if I've not pronounced your surname properly, James. And this is from Barrel Rider Games. It's approximately 130 pages long and is currently available in both PDF and a choice of print formats as Pay What You Want on Drive-Thru RPG. I've splurged out on the colour cover black and white interior version here. A very worthwhile purchase, and I'll put a link down below to where you can find that on Drive-Thru. Now, White Star is an OSR science fiction space opera game based on the Swords and Wizardry White Box rules, which I'm also a big fan of. If you're not aware of Sword and Wizardry White Box, it's an OSR product that attempts to model itself on the simplicity of basic D&D, but with some modern sensibilities and lessons learned. White Star takes this ball and runs with it into the science fiction genre. But John, I hear you say,
don't you spend loads of time complaining about people rewriting D&D to cover all manner of different games and genres?
Short answer, yes, I do. Because I think a lot of times these conversions are just slapped together and they don't really work. However, this clearly isn't the case with White Star. A lot of time and effort has clearly gone into this product. The book is a lovely digest size, as you can see there, and you all know my fondness for easily portable books. It opens with a single page intro where the author discusses their love of sci-fi and why White Box is a good fit as a rule system. The author claims that nothing is needed beyond this book to run an enjoyable sci-fi game. If that's true, it's an impressive claim, especially considering many more modern games that almost mandate buying numerous supplements and additional books. The first chapter is Attributes, and anyone who's played D&D or similar games won't find many surprises in this first chapter. It deals with the attributes that make up your character stats. These are the classic D&D attributes of strength, intelligence, dex, wisdom, constitution and charisma. Each attribute gets a short write-up telling you what it's for and a number of ways that you can determine stats if you don't want to go for that old 3d6 straight down the line feel so beloved of many older gamers. Most classes get bonus XP for having a particularly high score in an attribute relevant to their speciality. This seems like a nice way to point out a stat's importance without making it mandatory. One of the things I do like in this chapter are that there are box outs discussing optional house rules to vary the importance of stats, and this is a trend that continues throughout the book. Now, I don't know how thoroughly these house rules have been play tested, but most of them will have the whiff of familiarity to people who've slung those D&D dice in their time. If I had to make one very, very small criticism of the box outs, it's that rather than being black with white text, in my printed version, they're a sort of dull grey colour that, combined with the font use, can make them a little difficult to read, but it's hardly an insurmountable problem. I'm glad to see that charisma has an effect on how many assistants you can have and their loyalty. I always liked this rule back in the day and thought it was a nice way of making charisma more useful without just asking for social-based roles all the time, because personally, I'd rather roleplay that stuff myself. Your level in each stat gives you a bonus or penalty that the GM can bring to bear in certain situations. Now, I might hear some of you who are used to Pathfinder or the later iterations of D&D saying,
"But John, what about the skills? How are we going to determine everything?"
Well, that all comes down to attributes in White Star, as it did back in the original D&D game. Chapter 2 is Classes and Races. White Star gives you 4 core character classes: Aristocrat, Mercenary, Pilot and Star Knight, a sort of Jedi mystical type character. There are also 3 optional classes provided: Alien Brute, your big hulking sort of Klingon-esque warrior aliens, or your Wookiees or whatever, your Alien Mystic, the sort of wise otherworldly aliens, and robots. These classes are broad enough to cover a number of different science fiction concepts, but if you wanted to add extra stuff, it wouldn't be difficult to bring in classes from other OSR Star products, if you wanted to do that. The 3 optional classes have that whole race as class feel that the original D&D rocked with back in the day. I was never a fan of it when I played basic D&D, since I didn't understand why my dwarf couldn't be a cleric or whatever, but for some reason it seems to work a little better in White Star. To people used to more modern iterations of D&D or Pathfinder, where characters sprout new abilities and powers at seemingly every level, the classes in White Star may seem a little underwhelming or bare bones. Basically, your hit dice, your attack bonus, and your saving throws are the main things that change as you go up in level. You get 2 or 3 abilities at first level, and then maybe 1 or 2 at later levels. The core classes detail 10 levels, while the optional ones have less. As someone who is a fan of streamlined rules and not having to track ridiculously large lists of complexly interacting feats and powers, I found this very refreshing, reminding me that RPGs don't have to be complex to do what they do well. The abilities that the classes get nicely reinforce the flavour of that particular class. For example, the aristocrat can charm people with his silver tongue and give his allies bonuses with his inspiring words. The mercenary and the brute alien gain extra attacks against opponents with 1 hit dice or less, allowing them to mow their way through mooks and generic enemies with aplomb. The Star Knights and Alien Mystics also gain what are called gifts and meditations, and these work in a similar way to D&D spells, with the characters acquiring so many of them per level. Chapter 3 is a bigger list of equipment. It also describes the default currency of White Star, 1 credit being worth 10 subcredits or 100 chits. The chapter is laid out in a series of no-nonsense tables with a little bit of black and white art scattered through it. It's not the most visually appealing chapter, but it's only 8 digest-sized pages long. And let's face it, we all know what a crossbow or a standard ray gun looks like by now. Most of the standard equipment doesn't list bonuses or anything similar provided by the equipment, presumably relying on the GM to judge how the equipment affects your chance of success at a task, or even disallowing attempts entirely if the correct equipment isn't possessed. Weapons and armour are covered, running the gamut from battle axes and star swords all the way up to grenades and energy shields. I like that standard equipment is kept separate from advanced technology, with advanced items being covered later, occupying a niche similar to magic items in D&D. The final part of the chapter discusses armour class, and, as with swords and wizardry, the book offers 2 alternatives, armour class and ascending armour class. Armour class is your THAC0 style method where the lower number is better, and ascending armour class is probably more familiar to the modern gamer, where a higher number is better. Personally, I find the ascending armour class, or AAC, more intuitive, but it's nice that both options are included. There's also a box out discussing how player groups could start with a starship despite the expense, which is cool, and a box out mentioning that non-starship vehicles aren't covered in this book, but in the White Star Companion. Now, although this does seem to fly a little in the face of the only needing this one book philosophy mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be too difficult to cobble together some vehicle stats if you really wanted to, and given the often secondary nature that non-starship vehicles tend to have in some sci-fi games, I don't think it's too bad of an omission, and I can certainly understand the author wanting to keep this book to a manageable size. Chapter 4 is titled Playing the Game, and it opens with a nice, clear explanation of the normal player-GM dynamic, and moves on to talk about how time is broken down into narrative and turn-based units depending on the needs of the story. Saving throws are discussed, essentially a character having to roll below their saving throw rating on a d20 when the GM calls for a save to avoid an unpleasant effect. It's a nice simple system and can be used to cover traps, resisting the effects of meditations and other things, with all classes receiving a bonus against certain hazards related to their theme. For example, the Alien Brute gets a +2 bonus to all saves against poisons and death. Surprise and secret doors are dealt with either based on the narrative fiction or a simple d6 roll, with most characters being able to detect a secret door if they are looking for them, with a roll of a 1 on a d6. Characters in White Star gain XP, allowing them to advance in level. The author offers some suggestions for the GM on how to issue these experience points. These include defeating opponents, uncovering advanced technology, and advancing the story. Tucked away at the end of this chapter is a short table containing prices for typical hired assistants, and it's nice to have all this information collated neatly in a single table. I can see this being very important, especially if the players have a ship that requires NPC crew. Chapter 5 deals with personal combat, and it covers what happens when opponents face each other in a melee or a ranged scenario, splitting the combat into a number of rounds. Combatants then act in initiative order until they reach the end of the round, and if the combat continues, you move on to the next round, and so on and so forth. Initiative is determined by a simple D6 roll, with the highest roll winning. Now this may seem a little random for some people, given that there's not really a lot of skills or feats that you can use to affect this. However, I think, as with a lot of OSR products, the inference is that the GM should apply a large dash of common sense to this system. If your PCs obviously have the drop on the enemy, then you don't need to roll, and vice versa. A short breakdown of how to make attack rolls follows. Essentially, the attacker rolls a d20. They add their base hit bonus along with any other bonuses. It's then compared to either the AC or the AAC, depending on what system you're using, to see if a hit has been scored. If it has, then damage is rolled based on the weapon, and it's deducted from the opponent's hit points. In the standard rules, anyone who hits 0 hit points is dead. That's it. Although there are some boxed out suggestions for GMs who want to tweak the lethality of their games. And if you wanted to import something like death saves, etc. from Dungeon World or from D&D 5th edition, it really wouldn't be that difficult to do. It just depends on how lethal you want to make your game. Healing is also covered in this chapter, with characters recovering 1 hit point per day of rest, or all of their hit points with 4 weeks rest. There's also a house rule suggesting that characters be allowed to bind their wounds after a battle, healing 1d4 hit points, or 2d4 if using a medkit. The next chapter is titled Starship Combat. And although it's called that, the chapter doesn't deal only with combat. It provides pretty much everything you need when it comes to starships in this game. The combat itself is fairly similar to personal combat with a few additions. Pilots add their bonuses to initiative, gunners add their base hit bonus, dex bonus and starship targeting bonus to attack rolls. Pilots can move a vessel up to its movement and still fire a pilot-linked weapon, or they can move the vessel up to twice its movement and not fire at all. The system for repairing damaged starships is quite simple. It takes 1 day and 20 credits worth of resources to repair 5 hit points of damage to a ship. A list of starship costs follows, ranging from single-person stunt fighters, costing 15,000 credits, up to mighty dreadnoughts requiring hundreds of crew members and costing 2,500,000 credits. Each starship then gets a bit of a write-up featuring a basic description, their stats and some nice black and white artwork. A small list of modifications is also provided, and these are like extra bolt-ons that can be purchased to modify a ship's stats or give it extra abilities. A formula is also provided to work out how much XP a party would obtain for defeating or besting enemy starships. Chapter 7 is titled Gifts and Meditations, and it covers the powers of Star Knights and Alien Mystics. As I said earlier, these function a little bit like spells in D&D. The Star Knights and Mystics prepare a number of these powers by meditating for 6 hours. Once a power is used, the energy used to access it is gone until they meditate again. This will be familiar to anyone who's used the sort of typical Vancian D&D system. The powers themselves are a nice mix of different abilities, being able to charm people, expand the senses, and eventually use things like telekinesis. I don't think it would be very difficult to port spells from other OSR games as meditations by just reskinning them slightly if the GM wanted to expand this repertoire. Or if you're not a fan of the whole Vancian system, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to find an alternative and port it wholesale into this game. Chapter 8 is Aliens and Creatures. Now for me this has to be one of my favourite chapters of the book, which is quite unusual for me given that I normally find bestiary chapters a little bit dull and samey. However, it's easy to see the author's widespread love and knowledge of science fiction in this chapter. Many of these creatures and opponents will look more than a little familiar to anyone who watches sci-fi, and the opportunity to have Canics and Assimilants in the same game is just too good an opportunity to pass up on, in my opinion. Each creature gets a half-page write-up, including their stat and a brief description. Whatever sort of sci-fi game you're looking for, you'll probably find something of use in this chapter. How even dragons get a look in. The next chapter covers advanced equipment, and it describes a number of rare and exotic items that can be discovered as treasure or plundered from opponents, covering things such as personal energy fields, cybernetics, advanced AI and high-tech weaponry, just to name a few of them. Now, White Star bills itself as a sandbox game, encouraging GMs to create settings that meet the needs of themselves and their group. Now, Chapter 10 offers some hints and basic advice for GMs looking to do that. It's a fairly short chapter and the information is quite brief, but it's well written, giving you some idea of how the various classes could work in situations ranging from a standard Star Wars-esque rebellion game to a campaign where players defend their world from invasion. Chapter 11 is a brief sample campaign primer detailing the Calron sector, a small sector of the galaxy chafing under the rules of the evil Galactic Consortium. The default assumption of this mini-campaign is that players will be rebels fighting against the Consortium and their cabals of vile Void Knights, the dark mirror to the Star Knights. A clean, clear hex map of the sector is provided, along with details of the major planets and space stations within the system. Although this would need some work, in my opinion, to make it a fully fleshed out campaign, I think as an introduction or a primer, it does a great job of showing what you can do with the White Star rules set. And in the final chapter, we have the sample adventure, the Second Battle of Bryn, taking place in the previously described Calron sector. It sees 6 to 8 characters of 1st to 3rd level attempting to infiltrate an asteroid base and retrieve rebellion plans. The adventure is a small dungeon crawl, providing a map of the asteroid base and detailing the forces that will oppose the PCs, including a band of ice pirates also after the information. It's a nice, simple starter that eases the GM into making some of the decisions that will become second nature as they become more experienced. But it also has a lot of potential for expansion, working as a great lead-in and introduction to the Calron sector. There's even some Firefly-style Reavers featured for good measure. The book then rounds off with a beautifully clear and crisp character sheet. So, in conclusion, I think that White Star is an excellent book that does a great job of taking the elegant simplicity inherent in basic D&D and the Swords and Wizardry white box game and applying it to the science fiction genre. Now, I don't think it's going to be to everyone's taste. Certainly, if you're looking for a more simulationist or hard sci-fi game, this probably isn't going to tick all the boxes for you. But if what you want is a simple set of rules that will be easy to pick up for anyone with even the smallest experience of D&D, and a book that provides a beautiful toolkit for GMs, whilst giving a number of well-intentioned nods to various sci-fi franchises, then you cannot go far wrong with this. This book is clearly laid out with some understated but very nice artwork. If you're looking for a quick science fiction fix that isn't going to cost you all your credits and that can potentially be expanded at your own pace and leisure, then White Star might just be the game for you. So, I hope you've enjoyed this RPG review. If you have any comments, as always, please put them in the comments box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I really do enjoy reading what you write. I hope if you've enjoyed it, you'll consider clicking on the red dice there to subscribe to my channel. Until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.